Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Springs Council's second Springs Advocacy 101 webinar. Why are Florida Springs still polluted? We have a great webinar. You can watch this on YouTube or Facebook Live. And those will be up on YouTube after we finish, so please share this. Today, we're going to be covering basin management action plans. As a lot of you know, late June, the Department of Environmental Protection put out 28 new basin management action plans, including 11 for outstanding Florida Springs. We're going to spend some time going through what we like about them, what we don't like, and then we're going to bring on two of the smartest people I know to talk about agriculture and septic tanks. So if you have questions, you can put them directly in the comments on our chat on Facebook and YouTube. We will have a Q&A session with all of our guests at the end of the webinar. All right, and I'm very happy to have Bob Palmer with me today. As many of you probably know, Bob is a board member of the Florida Springs Council and the Florida Springs Institute. Bob was instrumental in our 4-year legal challenge on the 2018 BMAP. So we're going to spend some time looking at where we've been, where we're going. And next slide, Clay. All right, Bob.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I'm going to give a little brief history. I'm not going to go into a super deep dive. We did that a year ago on the earlier webinar, but a little bit is helpful. So this is the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act, adopted in 2016. We had some very good provisions with respect to springs. The bill, of course, as typically happens, got weakened somewhat as it went through the legislature, but still when it came out of the sausage grinder, it was a good bill. There were five senators who were really key in moving this. None of them, of course, are in the legislature anymore because that's what happens with term limits, and that's another problem. But we'll talk about that on another webinar. Here's 6 bullets summarizing 6 key points about that 2016 legislation. I'll focus as we go along here a little bit on the first, third, and fourth. The first one requires that DEP write these BMAPs in a way that we achieve water quality standards in 20 years, which was 2038 at that point, because these BMAPs were finalized in 2018. What does that mean? It means meeting the TMDL, the total maximum daily load for each of these water bodies and water basins. So that's the first bullet. The third bullet, allocate nutrient reductions to polluters. That's a fancy way of saying polluters pay. So, if you're responsible for 50% of the nitrate pollution, for instance, in a spring shed, you should clean up roughly 50%. There's some wiggle room there in the law, but basically that means polluters pay. The fourth bullet, the law states that DEP has to account for future growth in population. That means not only human population growth with human beings, but also agriculture. So those are 3 of the very key provisions in that bill. Next one, Chloe, please. Thank you. So kind of similar to the last slide, we lost our case in front of the Department of Administrative Hearings. We challenged 5 of the Springs 13 BMAPs at that point. Not surprisingly, because we've had very little luck at DOA. We lost that case. That picture, although the header says 3 issues argued before the First District Court of Appeals, that picture is actually from the DOA hearing with the judge in the background. That's me in the foreground twiddling my thumbs. Next to me is John Thomas. John is still part of our legal team. And on the left side is Doug McLaughlin. Doug is still part of our legal team. So this is 6 years later, and although those 3 folks in there are old folks, including me, we're all still around, we're all still pitching. So after we lost at DOA, we went to the District Court of Appeals and we winnowed all our issues down to 3. These are the 3 main issues we argued with them. And you can see it there. One, the plans wouldn't achieve the TMDL within 20 years. The department's witnesses actually admitted they wouldn't achieve the TMDL in 20 years. Didn't account for growth, and nitrogen reductions weren't allocated to non-point sources. Again, that means polluter pays. So we took those issues to DCA. Next slide, please, Chloe. DCA invalidated the BMAPs. They said we were right. And this is their part of their finding in 2023. We're already 7 years past the legislation at this point when we won in DCA. This was about 2.5 years ago. You can see the final sentence, we reversed the department's final order and remand for further proceedings. Well, DEP took the word remand to mean delay. And so they made a lot of excuses why they couldn't do what the court found. They did a really lame job of dealing with polluter pays. We looked at, and actually we went back to the First District Court of Appeals and said, you guys got to fix this. DEP has not complied with your order. Part of DEP's argument was, well, we're going to have to redo these in 2025 anyway. So don't make us do anything now. We'll just fix all this in 2025. Here we are today. It is now 2025. So the court basically said, yeah, we'll give them till 2025. So that's where we are today. Even though we won the District Court of Appeals case, DEP won with their argument that they could delay for yet 2 more years and deal with it down the line. Next slide, please. Back in the day when we initially sued, we had 30 outstanding Florida Springs. Those are listed in the legislation. We still do. Back in 2016, there were 24 of these that were impaired by nitrate pollution. Now there are 26. So we've gone from 80% of the springs being compromised to 87% of the springs, outstanding Florida Springs being compromised. Next one, please. A little busy, but the message here is simple, and that is there's been backsliding. We're actually worse off than we were in 2018. I'll just look at those 2 big numbers, 68%, 72%. In 2018, to meet the requirements for all those 13 BMAPs, DEP would have had to reduce nitrate coming out of the springs by 68%. That number is now 72%. So we've slid back. Next slide, please. We have had some legislation since the original 2016 bill. None of this is nearly as impactful as what was in the original bill, but there's a few things that are interesting. The very first bill, 2020, there's a provision requiring the Department of Agriculture to visit every producer every 2 years and make sure that they're complying with best management practices. We actually had a really good project that one of our law students at UF did for us. Ryan, is that on our website anywhere? That study?
Mr. Bob,
I'm sorry?
we will find out.
Okay. Anyway, it's very good. Found that the data from these visits is very poorly documented. And even more interestingly, you'd think since it's been 5 years that the Department of Agriculture had to visit all these farms and producers and see that they're complying with best management practice, you'd figure they would use that information and that data when they redid these BMAPs this year. After all, why are they collecting the data otherwise? It turns out DEP didn't use any of the data from these visits in the BMAPs. They just ignored it, which is, I think, really not what the legislation intended at all. The next item, the second bullet, George Hockmuth will address that. Has to deal with regional agricultural projects that are supposed to reduce pollution significantly. And the very last one, fourth bullet here, 2023 legislation required these BMAPs, including the ones we're looking at now, to show enough projects and practices that will meet the 5-year goal, the 5-year milestone, which is this year. So there should be enough projects, policies, practices in these BMAPs that we're looking at today to meet what they're required to meet at the 5-year target. We will see down the line that they don't have those, but that's the requirement. Next, please. Couple good things in these BMAPs relative to, at least good relative to the original ones from 2018. The first bullet, they now do include allocations of load reduction. So in other words, they do have numbers for polluter pays. These load reductions are assigned to cities, municipalities, counties, agriculture generally, golf courses, a few other things. But they are, there is an effort to at least identify reductions that are required for the various entities. The second bullet, DEP this time around actually acknowledged that they have to achieve the TMDL in 20 years. And that was not what they said originally. In the original lawsuit, they said, we just have to have a target to achieve the TMDL, which was ridiculous because the target is the TMDL. It's a very circular argument, made no sense. The DOA judge, of course, agreed with it because that's what DOA does. But at least there's an acknowledgement, yes, we've got to achieve the TMDL in 20 years. I'll leave the third bullet on septic tanks to Mike. He's got a presentation on that. So next slide, please. There are deficiencies, however. Those are a few of the things that are positive. And there's a long list of these. I'm not going to go through them all, but the first one there, these BMAPs do not include enough strategies to achieve the TMDL in 20 years. Second bullet, nor do they include enough in most cases to achieve the 5-year milestones, which are this year. There are a few that purport to achieve that, and it's through, in most cases, through some very funny math involving how agricultural benefits are tabulated, and George will cover that. Next slide, please. We'll look at some more deficiencies. The first bullet, DEP said in these updates, yeah, we don't have a lot of projects in here, and it's not our fault. The cities, the towns, et cetera, didn't give us what we asked for. So what we're going to do is give them until January of 2026 to tell us how they intend to do that. Not even how they're going to, not even submitting the actual projects, but tell us how they intend to do that. There's nothing in statute that allows DEP to give people this, get out of jail free card. But if and when, we'll probably have some discussion later on of whether these will be challenged again by us or other groups. That clearly is an item that is challengeable. The law doesn't allow them to extend this deadline. The second bullet, interestingly, they did some calculations on population growth and what it meant that were, fairly professional estimates. It's not hard to do. Those estimates are done every year in Florida, county by county. But what was interesting is they never used these estimates in the BMAP. They said, here's some projections, but we're not actually going to use them to see what the impact of that would be. The next bullet, they didn't even look at agricultural growth. And the last bullet, George Hockmuth will get into that. Some of the numbers and claims made for how much reduction you get in nitrate from best management practice and various cost share projects. Next one, please. More things that we'll get into more detail later. This first bullet, again, these are these regional agricultural water quality projects that I think DEP calls ACE, ACE is their acronym. The bullet here says, we've asked repeatedly, I think Ryan's asked about 300 times, give me an example of one of these ACEs. There are no examples in the BMAPs, and we still haven't gotten a single example. George, bless his heart, has some suggestions, and so I'll leave that teaser out there. He will get to that. The next two relate to septic systems, and benefits there, and I will let Mike elaborate on those. So next slide, please. This looks busy. It's really pretty simple to understand. So we went through the BMAPs one by one, and there's a section in the back that shows best management practices. How many acres in this BMAP are enrollable, that should be enrolled in best management practices? How many actually are? So we just tabulated these into a table from both the 2018 BMAPs and the 2025 BMAPs, assuming that more and more people would be signing up for best management practices, because we had this provision, as I mentioned earlier, in the 2020 law, where the ag department representatives are supposed to go out, talk to every producer every 2 years. If they're not signed up, get them signed up. If they are, verify that they're doing it right. So we just assumed naively, I guess, that more and more ag producers would sign up in the intervening 7 years. We found the opposite. So if you look at the bottom of that, or just look at the right two columns, the bottom numbers in the right two columns. So what percent of the enrollable land, agricultural land, was actually enrolled in BMPs in 2017? And the answer is 57.4% down there at the bottom. 7 years later, that number that's enrolled is 55%. It's actually declined. We have fewer acres and a lower percentage of ag producers and ag acreage enrolled in BMPs than we did 8 years ago. I can't explain it. Maybe George will delve into that when his time comes here.
And Bob, before we leave that slide, just to make clear, every acre of agriculture has to be, by law, enrolled in best management practices if they're within a BMAP. So that number should be 100% if the producers and the state agencies were following and enforcing the law. It definitely should not be going downwards. Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Next one, Chloe. I think this is my last one. So we got these BMAPs dumped on us well, I shouldn't say dumped on us. That's pejorative. We received them in the end of June this year, a couple months ago. And they totaled about, just the Springs ones totaled like 1,700 pages. Very complicated, a lot of assumptions, a lot of math. And so we had a tight deadline to file a petition with DOA to challenge them if we chose to challenge them. We didn't think that was enough time to do a full analysis. So we asked for an extension of time to file our challenge. We suggested, I think it was early February next year, for the reason that DEP said they needed until January to get these plans from all the governments and so forth on how they intended to produce the projects that needed to be in the BMAP. We thought we needed to at least see those. So we gave them a couple, 3 weeks after that DEP January timetable and requested an extension into February. We just got this a day or two ago. It came back from DEP saying, we will grant you your extension, and you're getting an extension to November 24th of this year. So we're getting 3 months to digest and ponder our case and what we want to do and whether we want to file a challenge or challenges, which is good. We have a little more time to be thoughtful about it. On the other hand, that's still short of the time when DEP is supposed to be receiving all these plans from all these entities. So we're not going to have the full story even then. Last point I'll make, Ryan, before I go back to you, you'll see that this message from DEP was addressed not only to a bunch of Springs groups, but a bunch of other groups all over the state of Florida. Calusa Waterkeeper, Florida Oceanographic Society, et cetera. So Ryan mentioned earlier there were 20-some BMAPs released at the end of June, BMAP updates, 13 of which related to Springs, but the rest related to other water bodies that aren't Springs. And Ryan did a great job of talking to many other groups all over the state, from the Everglades up to the Panhandle, and got a number of other groups educated and online with the thought of challenging these. Nobody had ever challenged the BMAP until we did with our constituent groups in 2018. So that situation has changed, I think, due to the Florida Springs Council. There are now other groups around the state focused on BMAPs and focused on their watersheds. And with these main BMAPs are the only tool really in Florida for dealing with water quality and improving water quality. So that's an important breakthrough, I think, for us and for the environmental community in Florida. And with that, Ryan, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Bob. Great job. All right, next slide, Clay. So in a few minutes, we're going to have George Hockmuth join us to talk about agriculture, and he's going to be focusing on the Sewanee BMAP. And then we will have Mike Kleiber looking at septic tanks, focusing on the Wakaiwa Rock Springs BMAP. So I wanted to go through and just talk briefly about just the basic information you might want to know about those BMAPs before they kind of dive deep into the details. So for Sewanee, the Sewanee is by the numbers our most polluted springs basin. To achieve the TMDL, assuming no more people move into Sewanee and assuming no growth in agriculture, requires a reduction of 6.3 million pounds of nitrogen. You could just about add up all the other Springs BMAPs and you would come to the same necessary reduction. So the Sewanee is, without a doubt, our biggest challenge. For those of you who know the Sewanee, some of my favorite springs in the state. It's a wonderful area of the state, and it is heavily polluted largely by agriculture, which is what George is going to talk in a minute. By 2028, so just 3 years from now, to be able to achieve that provision in law that says that these BMAPs have to achieve the 5-year milestone, they will need to reduce pollution by almost 1.9 million pounds per year to hit that first milestone in 2028. And overall, Sewanee requires an 86% reduction in nitrogen loading. That is an enormous amount of pollution. If you think about trying to reduce your household budget by 86%, if I said cut back by 10%, you might be able to find a way to do it without, selling the cars and changing houses. If you had to cut back by 86%, as you can imagine, it would take some drastic changes. And the same is true of the Sewanee Basin. Next slide.
Ryan, I promise it's the last time I'll interrupt you.
No one believes you, Bob. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's true. I just want to point out here that 6 million pounds is a daunting figure, but that's not pounds going on the surface. That's not fertilizer hitting the surface. That's what's reaching the groundwater. To translate that roughly into pounds that are applied to the surface, it's closer to 50 million pounds, because that 50 million gets attenuated as it goes down through the ground and hits the groundwater. So 6 million is a lot, 50 million is even more.
Thanks, Bob. Next slide. All right, so for anyone who saw our BMAP webinar last year, you'll probably remember these slides. They're my favorite graphs we've ever produced. I know they look a little complicated, but they're really not. This is the progress on the Sewanee Springs BMAPs. So that first black dot at the left there, that's where we started. That's where we started in 2018 with nitrogen loading at the spring vent of about 3 million pounds. That white dot just to the right of it, that is where we should have been by 2023. And instead, where we are is that black dot above it. So instead of things having gone down 30%, they've actually gone up. And you can see that what DEP has done is they've just changed the targets. So now, instead of having that kind of gentle curve that we see in the 2018 BMAPs and the 2025 BMAPs, you can just see that it basically just falls off a cliff. And anyone who's looked at any, how change happens in nature or economies or any big systems, it's very rare that you see that kind of drastic change in outcome unless you have some kind of a drastic change in input. Next slide. So these are those allocations that Bob was talking about. This is what we won in the First District Court of Appeals. And theoretically, this is the, kind of the great hope we have for restoring our springs. So the good news is that we now have the allocations. As you can see, agriculture needs to reduce by about 1.6 million pounds by 2028. I think the next highest one on there is Suwannee County at about 50,000 pounds, and then Levy County at 20,000 pounds, and Dixie County at 20,000 pounds. So altogether, those numbers should add up to that 1.9 million pounds that we showed on the first slide in this section. Unfortunately, after all this time, we've only been able to get to about 760,000 pounds of credits, and George will talk a little bit about where that number comes from later. But what that means is that the BMAP, even if everything goes exactly as DEP predicts, exactly as they planned, the BMAP is only scheduled to achieve 41% of that 5-year goal. And remember, that 5-year goal is only 30% of the actual reduction that's needed, right? So what we're talking about is we're talking maybe 13% reduction of the 100% reduction that's needed in just 13 years. So the Suwannee BMAP is not on track to achieve water quality goals, and it is just facially not compliant with the requirements of either the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act or the House Bill 1379 that was passed in 2023. Next slide. So reductions were allocated to agriculture, 15 local governments, private wastewater treatment facilities, and private golf courses. Of the 18 entities that have to reduce pollution, 13 of them do not have a single project. We are 8 years into this process. 13 entities don't have a single project. They have reduced exactly 0 pounds of nitrogen in 8 years. In fact, they've increased their loading. 15 of the 18 entities are projected to miss their 5-year milestones. You'll hear Bob and I talk and everyone about a lot of our concerns with the BMAPs, but all we really care about is achieving water quality goals. If everything else in the BMAP was wrong, but they were on track to achieve water quality goals, Bob and I would be cheering them on. But unfortunately, they're not doing the one thing that really matters, the one thing that the BMAPs are designed to do, which is to clean up the springs. Next slide, Clay. So now we're going to walk through the same thing for Wekiva Rock. As you'll hear from Mike, while the Suwannee is primarily an agriculturally dominated system, Wekiva Rock is a septic tank dominated system. And you can see the numbers here are much, much lower. So to achieve the TMDL requires about a 927,000 pound reduction, and they're required to make about 80,000 pound reduction by 2028. However, overall, it does still require a 76% reduction in nitrogen loading. So even though the gross numbers are not as large, the percentage is nearly as large as it was in the Suwannee, and that's actually a major change. Which is something Mike will talk about that I think is really interesting from what we saw in the original BMAPs put out in 2018. Next slide. So here's that same chart, and boy, is this scary. So once again, that black dot on the far left is where we started. That white dot to the right of it, underneath it, that's where we should have been. And according to DEP, look where we are. So we have actually seen pollution increase in the last 5 years more than DEP was required to make it decrease. And once again, if you see that crazy downline from 2028 to 2023 in green, it's hard to imagine that that's actually going to occur. Next slide. So here we have, again, the allocations. The big one here is Orange County, with a required allocation of 156,000 pounds by 2028, followed by Seminole County and Ocoee and Apopka, all coming in around 20,000 pound reduction, give or take. Here, of the required 278,000 pound reduction in the BMAP and under state law, all of the projects added together only get us to 64,000 pounds, or 23% of the goal. And again, that goal is only 30% of the total. So there we're talking about, less than 5% of the total reduction that needs to be achieved, and only a fifth of the reduction that DEP is legally obligated to achieve under state law by 2028. Next. In this case, reductions were allocated to agriculture, 13 local governments, private wastewater, and private golf courses. 5 of the 16 entities have no ongoing or planned projects, and none of the entities are projected to achieve, that should say miss, achieve, not miss. 0 of 16 entities are projected to achieve the 5-year milestone. At this point, they are all projected to miss it. All right. So we have some questions that were submitted in advance. These were questions that were sent in through social media, largely. There's a couple that were emailed to us. We're going to do most of the questions at the end, but we're going to go ahead and do some of these ones that were sent in early right now. So go for it, Clay. All right, the first question is, who is responsible for achieving BMAP goals? So the answer is the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They are the ones that in statute have the responsibility to draft and enforce basin management action plans that achieve water quality goals. But then now that we have these allocations, each of those entities also has a responsibility to make their portion of the reduction. So DEP is responsible for the overall water quality goal. And then each entity, agriculture, local governments, private golf courses, private wastewater treatment facilities, they all need to meet their specific portion of the reduction. And of course, if every one of the entities met their reduction, then we would meet the overall reduction and DEP would achieve the overall goal. When it gets to agriculture and FDEPs, it's a little bit complicated because while DEP is the ones responsible for achieving the reduction, a lot of the projects and numbers and the BMPs all go back to FDEPs. So, to the extent that agriculture is failing to meet its allocations to be part of the solution, I think a lot of that does go back on FDEPs. But at the end of the day, DEP, they asked for this responsibility. I was in the rooms. They were the ones who wanted to run the BMAPs. And I think they're kind of like the dog that caught the car, because now that they have the BMAPs, they clearly don't know what to do with them. Next slide. All right, Bob, what are the baseline nitrogen measurements in Springs? And I think what they're looking for here is, if we go back to some of the early data, how much nitrogen was in Springs before we had, 20 million people in the state?
Yeah, I think the consensus is the concentration of nitrates way back when, before we started polluting the hell out of them, was probably 0.05 milligrams per liter. That's also 0.05 parts per million. Could have been less than that, but that's generally regarded as kind of background. There are some springs that are, kind of approaching that still, that are in relatively unpolluted areas. But the target in most of these BMAPs, the target to achieve the TM for most of them is 0.35 milligrams per liter, or 7 times as much as historical levels from way back. So even the target is not, pristine what it used to be in 1900. The target is 7 times or more greater than what used to be. And I just, parenthetically, there are a few springs that don't have a target of 0.335 that are actually slightly lower than that, 0.28 and so forth. But 0.35 is kind of the default target.
All right, and following up on that, Bob, why haven't the target levels been tightened over the last 30 years?
Well, we're not achieving them as it is. So tighten it would be a very heavy lift. And there are these contrarian voices out there that say, nitrogen is just part of the problem or not a serious part of the problem. There are other factors that affect water quality in springs besides nitrate. There's oxygen. I think flow is very important in springs. So to lower that target from 0.35, given that we're nowhere near it today in most of these springs, and given that there are contrarian voices anyway, that would be a very heavy lift to reduce them.
Yeah, let's. I think the 0.35 target is really what they're hoping is going to prevent algae. So if we can get it down to that level, I think we could. That would be amazing, and we can see what else needs to be done. All right. The next question was, Why do some BMAPs include large state facilities such as prisons, while others, such as Springs BMAPs, do not include these contributors? And that was a great question. It actually took me some research to dig into it. And what it basically depends on is whether or not they are being served by a municipal water source. So if you have a large state facility that has its own wastewater treatment, essentially, they're basically being treated as a private wastewater treatment facility. When you have a large state facility that's hooked up to city water, someone else that has an allocation already, then they're just wrapped up into that local government's allocation and they don't get a separate listing in the BMAP. And finally, Bob, one more for you. If there isn't enough data to pinpoint the actual sources of pollution, how can realistic solutions be developed?
We're dealing here, obviously, mostly with non-point source pollution. So we don't have a bunch of pipes out there that we can go out and monitor the outflow from all these pipes and see exactly what each polluter or contributor is contributing. That's just the way it works with non-points. So we're sort of stuck with modeling. And obviously there's problems with modeling. I think the tool that DEP uses is something called NSILT, which is an acronym where they attempt to calculate how much from each source actually reaches groundwater. I think in the previous webinar, which people can locate online, we spent a fair amount of time talking about issues with NSILT and how accurate it is and modeling, potential modeling errors and all that. We're not going to do that on this webinar. We don't have time to do that. But there are a lot of questionable assumptions in the NSILT. And I think for now, we just kind of have to accept it. And as Ryan said earlier, if we get down to 0.35, we see where we are and we take it from there. That's known as adaptive management. DEP loves to brag about that their strategy is adaptive management. In this case, it's probably a good idea. I'd love to see us get down to something around 0.35, and then we can see what else we have to do or not do at that point. But in the interim, I think we're largely stuck with modeling.
But Bob, would you agree that, agriculture is the predominant source of pollution in the Sewanee and Santa Fe? Septic tanks are the predominant source of pollution in Wekiva, Volusia Blue. Like, we may not know the exact numbers, but I think we have a good idea of where the pollution is coming from within each spring shed and where the reductions need to take place. Would you agree with that?
And if I didn't, you'd fire me from the board, I think. Yeah, no,
you lose your whole salary.
Yeah, exactly. I do agree with that. And for anybody on the line that's curious about their particular area, they can go on, pull up the BMAP for their spring and look. Every BMAP has a pie chart showing sources of nitrate. And, as Ryan said, that roughly speaking, they're all correct. Whether, lawn fertilizer is 18% or 28%, I think we can start questioning the numbers at that level. But the large contributors are not really controversial.
Thank you so much, Bob. We're going to bring you back for Q&A at the end, so hang out. And now it's my pleasure to welcome George Hawkmuth. George is a professor emeritus at UF, soil and water. He is an agricultural expert. He actually worked on many of the best management practices, has an incredible list of publications to his name. And since agriculture is the top source of pollution to Florida Springs, and I think it's something that we don't have a great understanding of, I wanted George to really take some time to walk us through what his thoughts are on the BMAPs, BMPs, cost share programs, and kind of do a deep dive into agriculture. So take it away, George. Thanks for being here.
All right. Well, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. My expertise sort of lends me in this direction to talk about agriculture. And for those of you that are in a non-agriculture dominated BMAP, you might have different sources. But some of the principles that we'll talk about, that Mike will talk about, can be replicated across the different BMAPs. I'm going to focus mostly on best management practices. This, in essence, is how agriculture meets its requirements in the BMAP. Chloe? I'm going to focus on the Swanee River Basin. As I said before, there are lots of other BMAPs out there. This one is made up, consists of several springs and an area outside of these spring sheds. I'll give you an example of the middle Swanee, which is the sort of the central green area in this map. Chloe? Okay, here is an example. The second line is the important part. Agriculture is by far the largest source of pollutant in all of these spring sheds in the Swanee River Basin BMAP. This is an example of the middle Swanee, which was that middle green area on the map, on the previous map. And you can just look at how huge the burden is on agriculture. That's the orange area. In this particular spring shed, one of the four spring sheds, farm fertilizer, that's the fertilizer that we apply to our crops to grow them, the nitrogen, is over 60% of the load to the groundwater. And if you add in the other agriculture entities, which I'm not going to talk about, I'm going to focus on farm fertilizer. But if you look at livestock, the capos, the non-capos, poultry production, you can see that farm fertilizer plus livestock wastes make up about 80% of the nitrogen load in this particular spring shed. And as already alluded to, that's a heck of a load, a burden on agriculture. Chloe? I did a little bit of calculations. Some of these numbers I pulled from the BMAP. In this Swanee River, now we're talking about the entire Swanee River BMAP here. There's 213 acres of row crops, and that would be things like peanuts, corn for grain, silage corn, vegetables, all would fall into that category. And then there's grazing land that is not heavily fertilized, but makes up a significant part of the crop areas. And then hay production. Again, a little over a third of this area is in hay production. And hay doesn't sound like it's too much of a serious situation, but when you consider that even the current BMP nitrogen rate for hay production is 80 pounds per cutting, and many growers get at least 4 cuttings, you can see that the total amount of nitrogen put on hay production is significant. So we have a total of around 340,000 acres of crop, and if you add in the livestock acres, we get about 390,000. Now, just for fun, in a meeting a year ago, I asked some of the agriculture representatives there if they could give me an estimate, because I was interested, because in the BMAP, if you go down into the appendix areas, you can see a list of all of the crops and the rates of fertilizer that DEP used to calculate the inputs. And Bob mentioned this INSILT. It's a model. It's basically an equation that you feed in data to it, and it'll calculate out the loads. It stands for nitrogen source inventory load tool, I think is what it stands for. So I asked, what do you think the average nitrogen application would be? And I got back 80. They chimed in that, well, probably about 80 across agriculture. We're talking about 80 pounds per acre. Now, I thought that was low because, as Ryan alluded to, I have a lot of experience in working with agriculture across the state, particularly vegetable producers. And I also knew that the numbers in the INSILT that go in as far as nitrogen fertilizer inputs aren't anywhere near 80. So then I chose 120, and then I said there's a high, I'll take a high, 160. And the 160 gets closer to sort of an average in the INSILT. But you'll see in the INSILT, there are quite a few crops that are pushing 300, and 2 or 3 of them are over 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre per crop. And some of these crops are 2 crops or more per year. So then I use the acres, the 340,000, and multiplied that out and got the total amount of fertilizer that's applied under those low, medium, and high categories. And I put this up here, spend a little bit of time with it because we'll talk about this as we go through. Chloe? So if you remember those numbers, 27 up to 54 million pounds, the total basin inload to groundwater from all sources is about 7.5 million pounds of N. The total basin load reduction required from all sources by 2038 is a little over 6 million pounds. So you can see right there that we have a lot of work to do, everybody that's contributing load to the groundwater. Agriculture, the third bullet there, agriculture reduction to groundwater is a little over 5 million pounds. Now this, if you notice the two stars, I'm including all of agriculture here. In the next bullet, I separate out farm fertilizer load. So farm fertilizer load is 4.6. And if you compare that to the total load from all sources, you can see that fertilizer load is huge. There's a lot of work to do, to be honest. Farm fertilizer load reduction required is 3.3 million. So a big portion of that farm fertilizer load those numbers, 3 compared to 4 million, is a pretty significant lifting job that agriculture has. Chloe? Now, I want to make a couple points to try to bring some of this together. And one of those is, I think Bob alluded to this, in the BMAP, the assumption is made for agriculture that about 80% of the nitrogen that we put on the surface to grow the crops gets assimilated. About 40% nitrogen, even in a good world, is taken up by the plants. Surprisingly, plants are not very good at taking up all of the nitrogen that we give them. And some of that is because of the other bullets that I put on there. When we put fertilizer on the soil for growing our crops, it doesn't all go into the crop, about 40, maybe 50 on a good day. Some of it is volatilized. If it lies on the surface of the soil, certain forms of nitrogen are easily volatilized off into the atmosphere. Some of this nitrogen may be lost by runoff. That's not a big deal in most of our karst, sandy soil production areas where most of these springs are, but it's still, maybe a few percent. Some of this nitrogen is used by the microbes, the fungi and the bacteria that are normally in the soil. They do a good job because they help break down organic matter, making the nitrogen available to the crops. So some of this nitrogen is sort of stolen, if you will, to be used by these microbes. Some of the nitrogen can be converted to gaseous nitrogen into, particularly under wet soil conditions, and lost as gas. And some of the nitrogen can be attached to the soil particles. But since we're talking about nitrate as the pollutant, any nitrogen that's attached to soil particles is rapidly converted to nitrate by those same microbes. So in the BMAP, DEP assumes that about 80% of the nitrogen that we put on the soil to grow crops goes through this process. And because of that is, prevented is not really the right word I want, but it means that 80% of the nitrate goes into these processes and does not reach the groundwater. About 20% is leached. Now, I want to just mention here that this 80% attenuation is used sort of as a general number in the BMAPs. There is one BMAP, Jackson Blue, that actually uses 60% instead because it's irrigated agriculture. And that's an important point because a lot of the agriculture in these BMAPs would not be irrigated. It might be closer to the 80%. But if you have heavily irrigated agriculture, and if you over irrigate, you're going to wash a lot of that nitrate below where these processes can happen. but DEP chooses generally to use the 80%. So I say that because what I know about some of the research that I've done, I think the 80% is probably overestimating what the good processes that can help us do. Chloe? So that 3.3 million total number is the pounds of farm fertilizer that must be reduced from the spring at the spring vent. That's not the fertilizer nitrogen reduction required at the surface because of the processes that I just mentioned to you. And I'll go through what I think is a relatively simple calculation that'll help make this a little bit clearer. But just recall that about 80% of the nitrogen that we apply, it goes down, but something happens to it along the way to the springs to remove it from a pollution event. 20% makes it to the spring, and that's our responsibility. Nature takes care of the 80%, so to speak, and we have 20% that we have to work on. Chloe? So I tried to make this a little bit more clear and to relate it to the numbers that I gave you earlier, the low, medium, and high fertilizer application. So the farm fertilizer load to the groundwater is 4.6 million. The fertilizer load reduction, the amount that we have to get out of that 4.6 is 3.2. That leaves 4.6 minus 3.3 is 1.362717 pounds of N that essentially are allowed, if you will, to reach the groundwater and still allow us to meet the TMDL. That sounds like a huge number to me, but we have a lot of water in the ground. So 1.36 can be allowed. So assuming that 20% is going to get through that 1.36 represents the 20%, how much are we allowed to put on the surface so that when all those processes that happen down will result in just the right amount of nitrate getting to the springs so that we can achieve the TMDL? And so the simple math, 1.36 divided by 20% gives us 6.8 million pounds that are allowed to be applied to the surface in this BMAP. 6.8. Now go down and look at the table. So that 6.8 is the amount of fertilizer, farm fertilizer, that we can apply to grow crops, and assuming that 20% of it leaks through the system to still allow us to meet the TMDL. Then look at the job that we have to do. At the low nitrogen rate of 80 pounds per acre, there's the 27 total. We subtract out the allowance that we're allowed to use, still meet the TMDL. We still have 20 million pounds left to go somewhere. And if you go up the chart, 120, 160, and for some of our crops, 160 is half of what we apply. You can see that we're anywhere from 20 million to 47 million pounds of farm fertilizer that has to go away in order to, under these scenarios, to allow us to meet the TMDL. And I used the figure 341,000 acres of crops in the Swanee River Basin. So those of us that look at this and understand agriculture, and those of us that don't even understand agriculture but know big numbers when we see them, this is a monumental task. In fact, some of my colleagues have said, ain't no way, George. Chloe? So let's talk about these specific best management practices. We know now from what I've told you up till now, this is a huge job. We have a lot of nitrogen to get out of the system if we're going to meet the TMDL in this Swanee River basin. And other basins that are heavily influenced by agriculture, like Santa Fe, are going to have the same problem. Their numbers may be a little different, but the percentages and the effort that they have to put in are just like Swanee. So adopting BMPs, best management practices, is the main way agriculture is asked to address its BMAP responsibilities for reducing that in pollution. Whether you're talking about 27 or 50 or more, BMPs are the main way that DEP and FDACs ask agriculture to play a role. Chloe? And here's an interesting definition. And this, I think personally, I think this is one of the reasons why we have so much trouble with agriculture. This is the definition that FDACS uses to define a BMP. And so if I'm teaching a class about sustainability and we're talking about BMPs, this is the definition I use. And I highlighted a couple of the key words in there. I don't want to read this to you, but it's a practice. It's something that farmers do with their land, with their crops. That practice is supposed to be developed through research, testing of this practice to make sure that it's efficient in both in terms of reducing leaching under that crop in that research field, and also allows a good yield or production. So it has to be effective and practicable. I don't like that word. I just, practicable. This doesn't sound right. But anyway, it has to be something that is effective and something that farmers are likely to be able to do. And also it's to improve water quality. And so you have to do two things. You have to improve water quality and you have to maintain good yields. And to me, that's where there's a lot of problems in terms of coming to grips with how we're going to achieve the environmental aspects of this whole issue. Chloe? And so this summarizes, I've tried to summarize here for you. BMPs for agriculture discharges must reflect a balance. I can't tell you what a balance is, knowing what I see with the numbers. A balance between water quality improvements and agriculture productivity. Those numbers that I showed you in that chart with the amounts of fertilizer that have to be removed, I just don't see how you get a balance here. We'll talk about some specific BMPs and practices here, and you can judge for yourself how effective you think they will be. As mentioned already earlier in this webinar, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, specifically the Office of Ag Water Policy, has a responsibility to achieve the adoption. And already was described to you, DEP is the responsible party up here to make sure all of this gets done and we achieve the goals. And for agriculture, FDACS is the entity that is responsible for making sure these BMPs and whatever agriculture needs to do is actually implemented and followed up on. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Chloe? Okay, so where do these BMPs come from? Traditionally, what we now call best management practices, we started back in the 90s with some programs specifically in the Swanee area to look at best management practices. Up until then, when I came here to Florida back in the early 80s to do research, I was just interested in reducing fertilizer from the standpoint that it saved money for farmers and also, surprisingly maybe, increased quality of fruits. For example, you got peppers with thicker walls, sweeter strawberries, things like that. So I thought we were onto something by trying to encourage farmers to reduce nitrogen. So here's a whole bunch of studies all plotted together. When you put on 0 nitrogen on the y-axis, you get a range of fairly low yields. And then as you increase the nitrogen across the x-axis, you increase yields. It comes up pretty quick, surprisingly. And then it kind of levels off. And as you start to over-fertilize with nitrogen, you actually get some decreases in yield. So what we do is we look at all of these studies, we can put them all together, and we can predict where would be a reasonable nitrogen rate for drip irrigated tomato. And you can look at these data and, you might argue with me between 100, 200 to 250. The current recommendation is 200, which is gracious plenty to produce good yielding tomatoes. So that's one part of a BMP. I've summarized over on the right, that list of words, the 5 R's, the 5 rights to managing fertilizer: right rate, right source, right placement, right timing. And importantly, if you remember anything from this presentation, remember the importance of irrigation, water application, to nitrate pollution in the groundwater. Because if we over irrigate, we wash the nitrates down below the root zone and it ends up in the groundwater. So many of my colleagues focus only on part 4. I added right irrigation about 10 years ago to this list. And I maintain that you do not have a BMP if you don't have a practice or a suite of practices that addresses all 5 of these. And I'll give you an example. If we say right rate for tomatoes is 200, and I don't help the grower determine how to manage the irrigation, the grower will tell me, I can't grow tomatoes on 200, George. I need 300. And the reason is, when you start looking in deeply, you'll find that that producer might be over irrigating. So I maintain that and I will argue with anybody that says, here's my BMPs. And I'm going to say, what are the practices that are included in your BMPs? If you don't have all 5 of these nailed down, you do not have a BMP. And later on, Bob mentioned this, there's some reasons why there might be some reasons why farmers we only have half of them signing up, and the nitrate is actually increasing. And I think some of this goes back to this notion of understanding the fullness of a BMP. The lower right-hand picture is a liquid applicator for corn that is banding the fertilizer near the corn plant, rather than spreading it through a center pivot irrigation and spraying all the areas of the soil that don't even have a root. I mean, my family grew up farming. They knew this 60 to 80 years ago. Why is this so new to us? But this is what we have to do. Again, all those components have to be included to be a BMP. Chloe? Okay. The picture on the left is the current version of the vegetable and agronomic crop BMP manual. This is where all of the suite of BMPs that a farmer can sit down and select. There's a lot of information about all of these, these BMPs, but it's very sparse on how to put these BMPs together, these practices together in a true BMP. My definition of a true BMP. The process: a farmer or a landowner will file what's called a notification of intent, or a notice of intent, NOI, to follow BMPs. A FDAC's staff person will sit down with that farmer and encourage them to sign the notification of intent. If they'd say, okay, yeah, I'll sign. Then the next discussion is to select the BMPs that farmer is going to implement. And different farms, because they grow different crops, they're in different areas, soil, there's a whole lot of reasons why farms would differ. But nonetheless, they're all required to sign on to a notification of intent. Apparently only half of them, roughly, have done this. And then they select the appropriate BMPs that they're going to implement. They also consent at that time to have the implementation verification visits every 2 years by an FDAC's staff member. And as was pointed out earlier, these IV visits are to basically see if BMPs have been implemented, how well they're doing, and to collect fertilizer data, input data from that farmer. Those data are not publicized. They're summarized, they're put together as a sort of I'm searching for the right word, combination from all of the sources and fields and crops from that farm, and also across agriculture. DEP has these data, and Bob alluded to the fact that the data are not used in updating the BMAPs. They've been collecting data for 2 or 3 years. So they have to do that every 2 years. And those are called IV implementation verification visits. Also at that time, if that farmer has signed on to do a special practice, then that is also evaluated at that particular time. How well is that farmer implementing? If they signed on for a cost share and they bought a fertilizer band piece of equipment, are they using it? And how well are they using it? So Chloe, all those things can be determined at that IV visit. So what does a farmer get from this? We've already mentioned that they can then become eligible to get cost share money to help implement a practice. Some of these practices, BMPs, would result in the farmer spending, tens of thousands of dollars. So the idea is that if taxpayers vote to have this kind of a process implemented, then they should share some of the costs. I really don't have a problem with that, but I'm very concerned that all these practices do get faithfully implemented and followed up on. But the grower gets the big carrot, and that is the waiver of compliance with state water quality standards. In other words, that farmer, by signing on to implement BMPs, is assumed to be a non-polluter as far as nitrates go. Chloe? And there's also some other things. I mentioned cost share can qualify for cost share funds. These cost share funds might come from FDEPs. They might come from other agencies, water management districts, different places. And sometimes they'll team up and cost share the cost share. But the problem that I have with cost shares, or the potential problem, is that they may be limited in what they address. Remember, I said there has to be 5 parts pulled together to make a BMP. Well, maybe the cost share only funds the banding fertilizer applicator. But if the farmer doesn't cut back on fertilizer, because banding should be more efficient, right? You're not putting the fertilizer all over the place. You're just putting it where the crop needs it. But if the rates don't change, then you're losing that efficiency. If you're not controlling the irrigation, I don't care how you apply the fertilizer, it's going to leach. So cost share programs, I think, can be limited in what they address and how effective they are. So there are benefits to them because, in a way, because money's involved, economics to a farmer, they do sort of put money on the table and incentivize a farmer to maybe come closer to adopting BMPs. Maybe they said, you know what, to do all that stuff is too expensive. And then somebody says, well, I can help cover the costs. And are there problems? I've already alluded to the fact that, yes, there are some problems. Because in many, many cases, maybe all cases, they're not addressing all of the components of a true BMP. And the IV visits are supposed to help solve this. Are the farmers really adopting them faithfully? Chloe? Additional aspects to signing up. I think this was already mentioned. There is a 15% credit for row crops and 10% for livestock, just for signing up. So this is a credit towards the reduction in nitrogen needed. So where did 15% come from? Well, it came from, as best I can determine, from some modeling research done in South Florida. And so how well does research done in Florida on different kinds of soils, where you're talking about the organic soils of Okeechobee or the heavier soils that have an underlying clay layer, spodosol, how does that apply to in the Springs area? I'll show you here also how it's calculated. And this hurts because we're only about half signed up. So you take the total BMAP farm fertilizer load, you divide it by the total farm acres in the BMAP. So we would take our load, our total load, fertilizer load, which was what, 4.6 million, divide it by the 341,000 acres in the BMAP. That we get a load of nitrogen per acre. We take that number, and I did a calculation here a few minutes ago. let me just say this, go through this first, and then I'll come back to that. The per acre load then is multiplied by the acres enrolled and by this 0.15, 15% credit. So then you come out with a total loading credit. And so you have to have a lot of good things going in order to benefit from this. You have to have a lot of people signing up, and Bob already pointed out only half are signed up. So we're sitting at 50% of ability to take advantage, growers to take advantage of this credit. Is the credit realistic? It's like I said, it's based on data elsewhere in the state. But anyway, that's what we've got to work with. That's what DEP is using. So the unknowns is the BMAP FF fertilizer load accurate? And that's another big question. Is the 15% credit applicable to the Springs area? Chloe? 15% doesn't sound like a lot, but if all of the growers in the basin, in the Suwannee Basin, signed on, and you did the calculation, it would come to about 700,000 pounds of nitrogen credit that agriculture would get off of the top of that 4.6 reduction. So what if a farm decides not to file an intent? Then that farmer or landowner must implement groundwater testing program. These are monitoring wells that are drilled into the aquifer and sampled to make sure that that farm is not running the groundwater is not running above the TMDL. Basically prove that that grower is not polluting. It even says it in the BMAP. This provision has never been implemented. And we have half of the farmers that have not signed on to this program. So some people will ask, why has this provision been implemented at the farmer level? The ones that have said, no, I'm not interested in doing BMPs, not interested in NOIs, and they're supposed to monitor to show that they are not polluting, and this still today has not been implemented or enforced. So we still have a long way to go for 100% sign up. And if there's no accountability to the bad actors, then that's bad on two things. One is they just keep on doing what they're doing, but everybody else that's playing by the rules and doing what they should be doing, they get shamed along with the bad actors. Chloe? So encouraging farmers to adopt BMPs, there's a lot of actors in this, most notably University of Florida IFAS research and extension. As I mentioned before, the University of Florida largely does all of the research to develop BMPs. I showed you that chart with tomato. There's thousands of those kinds of charts out there. The extension service takes that information, presents it, takes it out to growers, makes presentations, does on-farm demonstrations of give me a half an acre of your watermelon field and let's test a BMP. Let's implement the BMP. Compare that to your standard practice. Field days, all kinds of things to demonstrate to farmers what reducing nitrogen might look like on their farm, and to help them adapt those 5 R's to make them work on their farm. Farm Bureau also has what it calls the CARES program. It's County Alliance for Responsibility and Environmental Stewardship. It's been going on since about 2001. And each year they select various farmers that seem to be, trying to make some positive advances, and they recognize them with the CARES Award. The farmer gets a sign to put out at the entrance to their farm, "This farm cares." So there's agencies, University, Farm Bureau. There's also other agencies that have money, not only to do the cost share, but also to provide for grants for various entities, most notably the researchers and the extension folks in IFAS, to carry out some of this work, and also to provide funds for the cost share programs. Chloe? I'll finish up here in a bit. I know we're running long. However, even DEP in the BMAP language admits that BMPs will not meet the entire agriculture N reduction requirements. And I think all of us on this webinar probably have already suspected that might be true. So if BMPs by themselves are not going to do it, then what are the kinds of projects, innovative technologies might be needed? And in fact, DEP suggests in the BMAP, at least in the Swanee BMAP, that there's going to be needed other technologies and other practices to help. Chloe? FDEP suggests, I think Bob alluded to this, these agriculture cooperative research elements. They call them ACE. And these are big projects that are to be implemented in areas where agriculture contributes at least 20% of the non-point discharge. And FDACS is supposed to work with DEP and agriculture producers to come up with what some of these ideas might be. And if you look through the BMAP, you can't discern what these are, much less the specifics about any of these potential projects. So they're kind of a dream that DEP has, and they're hoping that people will get together and fill in some of the blanks. The blanks are big. Chloe? So Ryan alluded to this. The three of us, Bob, Ryan, and I, got our heads together, and I sat down here at home and tried to come up with some ideas that might be proposed to FDACS. If FDACS can't come up with this, then FSC has an opportunity to get in the ball game and tell them, here's our ideas, and see if some of them would fly. They're basically combinations of traditional projects that focus on water treatment. We could have land acquisition in fee or conservation easements. Already there's a couple examples of this in agriculture that have been paid for and implemented in the last couple years. What we would call dispersed water management projects, site-specific water quality improvement projects. I can think of maybe, it is not going to be for all of the Swanee Basin, but there could be greenhouse production with nutrient recirculation and reutilization. Chloe? And there's a few more. You could envision multiple farms cooperating on some kind of a project to reduce fertilizer on a large tract. If you could get them to buy into this, maybe you have that group of farmers, come down a little bit in nitrogen rate. Where runoff from the farm is possible, you could have a constructed wetland where the nutrient-laden water flows in to be treated or taken up by wetland plants. This is probably not going to be wide in the Springs area because of the types of soils that we have. Runoff is not going to be a big deal, but it could be on a nursery where you could collect the runoff from the irrigated nursery pots. And this is already being researched by UF. You could also pump and treat groundwater to reduce the nitrogen concentration. Already, there are projects. There's been a large funded project to do exactly this. Sink a well in the ground, pump the groundwater out, run it through a treatment wetland or through some kind of biological filter that would reduce the nitrogen and convert it into gas, so it would be lost to the atmosphere. You can imagine the cost and implementation challenges. Multiple contiguous farms might agree in a particular watershed to reduce fertilizer with monitoring of the associated water body. Taxpayers would then be asked to cover the documented lost profits if these farmers, by reducing fertilizer, lost some money. But there's ideas out there that might constitute an ACE. Chloe? But here are some thoughts. New technologies may be needed, and what are those costs associated with them? Farm buyouts or easements? Yeah, great, but then what? What do you do with that land? Pine trees has been suggested. Change to low or no fertilizer crops, Profitability is going to be a big question on the part of agriculture. These are going to have to be decisions that taxpayers will need to make as we work through this idea about ACE. Chloe? So our BMP is working. Bob, has already alluded to the relatively low sign up adoption rate in the Swanee River Basin. Was 72%. Now it's 66%. So it's declining. And why is the rate declining? I'd be interested if some folks could put in the comment section why you think the rate of signing NOIs is declining. I can offer a couple. One is that this has been going on for a long, long time. This BMP stuff started back in the 90s. And it could be that people are just burned out. Farmers are just tired of dealing with, they'll say the paperwork and so forth. The monitoring of these programs has just been non-existent. So we don't know, farmers don't know if they're actually making progress by adopting all these BMPs. So some of them may just get tired and say, you know what, I'm out. So I think you can think of some things that might be related to the rate of this declining. It also could be that government just doesn't have enough money to parcel out for these cost share programs, and some farms just get left behind. They can't get the money, so they say, okay, well, if I can't get the money, I can't do these BMPs. Those are a few that I might offer. Chloe? Okay, and near the end here, these are some data from a study done by Florida Springs Council with the Florida Springs Institute. And Bob mentioned the springs, the 26 springs and the 30 springs. Well, here's some data. These are from 2022. And the x-axis is the NOx, which is mostly nitrate, nitrogen, that in terms of parts per million or milligrams per liter. And you can see back in 2000, we were running around 1, and then it just slowly increased over the years. And then when the first BMAP was put in place in 2018, that's the red line. And now you can see post that BMAP, when all these BMPs and all this stuff was supposed to be implemented and being carried out to reduce the nitrogen in the groundwater. But look at what really has happened. It's increased, and it doesn't take a rocket science or a mathematician to draw a straight line, and it would have a pretty high R-square value of increasing nitrate concentration over the years, even under a BMAP. Chloe? Again, just indicating that the issues with notification of intents, signing up, not enough money to implement cost share, all of those kinds of things, misunderstanding, I think, what a true BMP entails, and then looking at the water quality data increasing in linear fashion over the years, even after we've implemented a BMAP, we got a long ways to go. And I really hope. I spent my whole career, 40 years, working in this area, and I'm still hopeful, but I don't know. There's some people that say, George, you're just an optimist. This isn't gonna happen. So can agriculture exist in this karst soils in this area of these springs? Can it exist? Especially not under current practices. There's going to have to be some drastic changes along the way. So we still have a long way to go. Okay, Ryan, that's it.
Thank you so much, George. I've been doing this for quite a while, and that's the first presentation like this I've seen in an environmental setting. So really appreciate you coming on. Stick around with us, and we'll bring you back to answer some questions at the end. All right, next slide, Chloe. All right, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome Mike Clyburn. Mike is one of my board members at the Florida Springs Council, as well as a longtime board member at Friends of Wekiva River. He is a retired environmental engineer who worked for over 40 years as a project manager on water supply and reclamation projects, mostly in Central Florida. Mike is going to tell us about the Wekiwa Rock Springs BMAP and specifically the role of septic tanks in that BMAP. So take it away, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. And thanks everyone for tuning in and for hanging in there. George is right. We have a long way to go to clean up the water, but I'm going to be done in 12 minutes. So hang in there. Most of you who live in Central Florida know that the Rock Springs and Wekiwa Springs contribute most of the flow in the Wekiwa River. Matter of fact, during dry weather, they contribute 80% of the flow in the river. So in order to improve water quality in the river, we have to address the groundwater quality that's coming out of the springs. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Chloe, next slide, please. I want to start by talking about some of the history of the Wekiwa River system. It's one of the state's most protected waters. The Wekiwa River Protection Act was signed in 1988 by Governor Martinez. It identified the Wekiwa protection area and established setbacks within that area from water and limited development density. The Wekiwa River, portions of it are designated as outstanding Florida waters, and portions are an aquatic preserve. It's also a national wild and scenic river. It's only one of two in the state. And then recently, Wekiwa and Rock Springs have been designated as outstanding Florida springs. So this is a very protected waterway. Chloe, next. But despite all of this, we'll see that there's still problems. The state's been working on this for years, even before 2008, which is when they established what the maximum concentration of nitrate should be in the river to control the algae. In 2008, they decided the river and the springs are impaired and set a nitrate goal of 0.286 milligrams per liter. If you think about that, that's like 5 ounces of nitrate in 1 million pounds of water. So it's very low concentrations that are causing the problems. In 2010, MacTech prepared a report showing or identifying the sources of nitrate and some strategies to control that. And then in 2015, the DEP issued the Wekiwa River Basin Management Action Plan, which mostly addressed surface waters. And now in 2018, the first Wekiwa and Rock Springs BMAP were issued. Chloe? But in spite of all these efforts and all these studies, there's just still nuisance algae that threaten the Wekiwa River. These are photos of eelgrass, and eelgrass, is a desirable species. That's what we want in the river. And they provide, the eelgrass provides habitat for the macroinvertebrates that the fish feed on, and habitat for the fish also. But this black goopy stuff you see on the eelgrass, that's the nuisance algae, and it chokes out the eelgrass. And so it reduces habitat and food for the fish and the other desirable aquatic plants. And the Wekiwa Wild and Scenic River has recently completed a mapping of eelgrass in portions of the Wekiwa River, so it'll be a baseline so we can see how it fares over time. Chloe? So in spite of all these studies and these BMAPs, nitrates are not declining in Wekiwa Springs. As you can see, the nitrates are running about 1 part per million, where they're supposed to be down around just under 0.3 parts per million in Wekiwa Springs. And in Rock Springs, Chloe, next slide, please. The nitrates are even higher. They're about 1.3 parts per million, which is about 4 times what the DEP has established as a safe level. Chloe? So the 2018 Wekiwa and Rock Springs BMAP had a goal of achieving the nitrogen criteria by 2038, which is, of course, a statutory deadline. They estimated the nitrogen load to the springs was about 1 million pounds a year. They said about almost 50% of it's coming from fertilizer, and about 29% from septic tanks. And it proposed a nitrogen load reduction of only about 200,000 pounds a year, about 20% of the total. And I set a 2028 nitrogen reduction goal of about 100,000 pounds a year, about half of that. Chloe? This is the Wekiwa Rock Springs BMAP area. It extends from I-4 over on the east side over to the west shore of Lake Apopka, and then on the north side to the Orange Seminole County line, and then down to the south along the turnpike. The 429 to about Independence Parkway area, and then there's a light red line which is hard to see, which is what they call the priority focus area, which is where DEP is focusing their efforts for reducing nitrogen concentrations that are in areas that are where they're most likely to impact the springs. Chloe? So these are some of the deficiencies that we, the Friends of the Wekiwa River and the Springs Council, identified in the 2018 BMAP. It didn't account for any additional load from development after 2018. It only proposed a load reduction to groundwater of about 20%. And we, at the time, we told them they were going to have to do closer to 75%, but they didn't listen to what we were suggesting. And they proposed only a 10% reduction of nitrogen from fertilizers. And if you remember, 50% of they estimate 50% of the load was coming from fertilizers. So that's about 500,000 pounds a year. So a 10% reduction would only be 50,000 pounds a year. So that wouldn't have accomplished much. And it didn't account for the attenuation of nitrates between the sources and the springs. So they were assuming that any load reduction at a source, even in a remote part of the BMAP area, would generate a corresponding reduction in the spring, 1 pound per 1 pound, and we know that's not the case. Chloe. So 2025 BMAP update has the same goal. Achieve nitrogen concentration goal by 2038, but the estimated nitrogen load to groundwater is 20% higher. And then they flip-flop the contributions from the sources. Now they're saying that fertilizers are responsible for about 33% of the load and septic tanks about half. And now they are proposing a nitrogen load reduction of 924,000 pounds a year, or 76%. So that is more appropriate. They have a 2028 reduction goal of 278,000 pounds a year. And then like Ryan mentioned earlier, they've assigned these load reductions to local governments. Chloe? This is just a graphic comparison of how these loads compare. On the left, you see the half of the load coming from fertilizers in the 2018 BMAP, and about 29% coming from septic tanks. And then on the right, over half of it's coming from septic tanks, and only a third of it from the fertilizer. Chloe? And this is a comparison of the proposed load reductions. The top graph shows the estimated load to groundwater. It's at 1.2 million in 2025. And the load reductions, now they're proposing a reduction of almost 4 times what they proposed in the 2018 BMAP. The goal by 2028 is about 3 times what they proposed in 2018. And as you can see at the bottom, they've only identified about 65,000 pounds nitrogen reduction so far. So there's a long way to go in the next 3 years. Chloe? Okay, the differences in these results, how much load is coming from the different sources, comes mainly from a couple of different assumptions. First of all, they determined that there were about 8% more septic tanks in 2025 than there were in 2018. They changed their estimate of the amount of nitrogen discharged by each person from 9 to 10. But these last two are the main ones. In 2018, they assumed that the house was only contributing nitrogen for part of the day because people were at school or working. But that's not the way those 9 pounds per person and 10 pounds per person were derived. They were derived based on a long-term average. So DEP had arbitrarily factored down the population per house, which reduced the loading by 20 to 40%, depending on the county. They also provide this BMAP update uses a more accurate estimate of what the attenuation rate is in a conventional septic tank of about 30%. Before they were assuming 53%, which was just way out of line. Next. So Friends of the Wekiva River, we don't believe that the BMAP is going to achieve the nitrogen reduction goals. First of all, there's no plan. They've given the local entities till January to come up with all they have to do is come up with a process to show how they're going to develop their plan. So there's no hard deadline. This is an unfunded state mandate. There's not enough money. The local governments don't have enough money to do all this work, and the DEP is not even asking for sufficient money for springs protection. I think in the past few years they've asked for $50 million a year. And just as an example, Orange County has undertaken a septic to sewer program just south and southwest of Wekiva Springs. It'll provide sewer to 2,000 homes that are on septic tank. That project's going to cost over $120 million. So there's not any way that there's enough money to address septic tank issues in the state. Next. Okay, so on a positive note, what can I do as an individual to help reduce the nitrogen load to groundwater? Convert your yard to Florida-friendly landscaping. Not necessarily all your yard, but even a portion of it. If you convert a third of it, that would, if everybody did, that would be a big reduction in the nitrogen load to groundwater. If you've got a lawn, don't apply fertilizer between June 1st and September 30th during the rainy season, which is when the fertilizer would get washed down into the groundwater. Don't use fertilizer with slow release nitrogen, minimum 65% and no phosphorus. Limit nitrogen application to 1 pound per 1,000 square foot per application, and don't apply fertilizer within 15 feet of a water body. I have to give a shout out to Seminole County. They have a great website that'll actually show you how to calculate how much fertilizer you need to put on your yard based on the content, the fertilizer content on the tag on the side of the fertilizer bag. So that's SeminoleCountyFL.gov, and then search for the fertilizer ordinance. So they have some great tips, and also about Florida-friendly landscaping. So with that, Ryan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And now we are going to bring back everybody and answer some questions that have come back in during the chat. I actually dropped that great Seminole County link Mike just mentioned into the comment section, so you can check that out. All right, not surprisingly, I think almost every question that we have had submitted is agriculture based. So I hope you're so ready to go, George. And if other people want to jump in after George takes a crack at it, feel free. So go ahead and pull up the first one for us, Chloe. Do the agricultural nitrogen loading numbers include small scale farms or just large industrial operations?
Everybody that does agriculture practices, growing crops, managing animals, livestock, fruit crops, are being asked to practice BMPs, and they're required to do BMPs in areas that are under a BMAP.
And there was a actual change to state law this session where they're going to set up a new BMP program for some of those smaller agricultural operations. That hasn't been set up yet, but I think that is something that we're going to be seeing coming down the road. I mean, would you agree, George, that really it's targeting the big industrial operations first is probably a wise thing with limited resources?
Yeah, the big commercial or operations are the ones that use the most fertilizer. Many small farms, may get some local compost or small bags of fertilizer. So as far as the amounts of fertilizer that are put on the land that end up in the groundwater are from our larger operations. Small, again, it depends. I'd be interested to see what they call a small farm, because USDA defines a small farmer as anybody that makes less than $350,000 cash income. So, that can cover a pretty wide swath of agriculture producers.
Thanks, George. Next question, Clay. Is it true that farmers typically use the minimum amount of fertilizer possible in order to save money?
I wish it were true. As I mentioned in my talk when I came here, that was the goal, to help farmers save money by reducing fertilizer, because fertilizer's not cheap. It only back then it only made up about 5 to 8% of the total input costs. Now it's more than that, maybe 10 or 12%, because the increases in prices of fertilizer. But farmers, it was always argued to me, well, Dr. Hockmuth, I use extra fertilizer because I consider it to be cheap insurance. And growers know that if they put on fertilizer and they get a leaching rain, they're going to have to add more fertilizer. And so when we went to plastic mulch, they were putting it all under the plastic mulch at one time, just in case, because they didn't have a chance to come back and replace it. So yeah, I wish that farmers, as far as rates of fertilizer, would even come close to the IFAS recommendations. But unfortunately, and it was, and actually a testimony in your lawsuit from an IFAS representative that farmers typically over-fertilize by 50%.
Next one, Clay. Is most of the agriculture grown in the Santa Fe and Sewanee food crops or commodity crops? I don't know if you know this, George. I think Bob might have some opinions, so whoever wants to chime in, or some knowledge, shouldn't say opinions.
Yeah, it won't be opinions. It'll have to be knowledge. Actually, it depends on what you consider a commodity crop. Food crops make up food crops, and by that I mean mostly vegetables, maybe a few tree fruits thrown in there, probably make up about 10 to 15% max of the crops. And the rest of them are going to be hay, corn, pastures. There's a large amount of peanuts grown. So whether you consider them food crops or commodity crops, I mean, they do have price protections, but there's about 80,000 acres of those. So that's significant, whichever category you add them to. But the fact of the matter is there's very little nitrogen used on peanuts because the crop itself fixes nitrogen. It's a legume.
If we were to keep the quote unquote food crops, but get rid of the commodity crops in these basins, I mean, how far do you think that would take us towards reaching water quality standards? I mean, the food that people eat, we can still grow that in these basins and have clean springs at the same time?
No. I mean, the numbers that I gave to you, the number of pounds of nitrogen that we have to reduce far exceeds, the fertilizer application is just so huge. You'd have to basically, look at the numbers. You'd have to get rid of agriculture all around to achieve those numbers of reduction. So, it's a good theoretical question, and maybe we might get a long ways there if you cut out certain cropping systems and ask the ones that are left to implement BMPs to the nth degree. It would make a big difference, yeah, but whether it would get us to the TMDL is doubtful.
Next one, Clay. All right, from Darlene Shade, we are talking about water quality. Please connect how this negatively impacts the springs which output clear water. Bob, you want to take a shot at this one?
Well, we all saw Mike's picture of the algae on the eelgrass. That's basically the bottom line answering this question. Mike, do you want to elaborate further? I mean, I guess I would say in addition to that, you get the algae, as Mike said, it affects the habitat and the breeding and everything else for lots of critters as well. And we have data from, for instance, Silver Spring documenting massive declines in diversity of fish and number of fish over the years in Silver Spring. And a lot of that's really, I think, related to it, to water quality, algae, and so forth. So once you start getting the algae, it sort of tumbles through the ecosystem and really affects everything. But Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, the water looks clear, but the nitrates and phosphorus that are in the water you don't see. But in these really small concentrations, they will allow algae to grow. And if you go to Silver Springs, I remember going there when I was in school in the 70s, and there's a big difference today. That you can see the algae. It's not as clear. The spring water is not as clear, and there's been studies showing the changes in the springs over the last 40, 50 years, and how much algae is growing, and how the springs appearance has changed over that time period.
And clear water, I think of Wakala, where I don't know how long ago it was, but there was a time when the glass bottom boats were running there frequently. I know as of I haven't been there in a couple of years, but it was down to a few days a year that they could even run those boats. And of course, that's a reflection of the lack of clear water at that particular spring. Even though the nitrate levels there are fairly close to 0.35, the water still isn't very clear.
All right, next question. From Robert Mills, back to you, George. Can regenerative farming practices be introduced to our educational system, and reducing chemical fertilizers help reduce the nitrogen loads?
Well, actually, many of these alternative production systems are being taught at the University of Florida. There's several courses that deal with all of these production practices. And yes, they could be introduced, but even those kinds of production practices require nutrients because plants are food crop plants. We haven't figured out how to grow food without nutrient, at least in fields, in farms, without nutrient inputs. Plants require 17 elements from the periodic table, and even algae requires all of these 17. Nitrogen happens to be the one that really gives it a boost in producing the quantity of algae, but algae requires boron and zinc and manganese, just like all plants. And that's the same with regenerative agriculture. We got to get the nutrients from somewhere. And unless we're very, very careful, going back to those 5 elements of a BMP, even with other kinds of agriculture production, we still have to manage irrigation and all of the other practices. But yes, there couldn't be some progress made with different production practices, but it's still not going to get us to where we want to be.
Thanks, George. Next one, Chloe. From Marissa, are there any known alternatives to fertilizer that could be used at a large scale and improve nitrate pollution? Back to you, George.
There are alternatives to fertilizer. If by fertilizer you mean inorganic fertilizer. Yes, there's organic sources of nutrients, compost, manures, that could be used, probably not at a large scale because they're very expensive to transport. It would be wonderful if we could figure out a way to use all the human waste and animal waste to grow crops. We still wouldn't have enough. And the other problem with organic waste is we can't predict how fast they're going to break down to release the nutrients. So that's always a challenge in large scale agriculture. But there's no magic. There's no magic out there. Nitrogen comes, our nitrate fertilizers come from the atmosphere through a process to convert it to ammonia and then to nitrate. So all of our fertilizer either comes from the air or eventually originates from the atmosphere. No easy answer, Marissa, to that.
Thanks, George. All right, 2 questions left, Chloe. From Robin Orlandi. Hey, Robin. Has any accounting been done related to septic pump out streams for RV parks? That effluent is super saturated nutrients as well as chemical pollutants from tank treatments, known issue in waste. I will say that it is included in the calculations for the insult. They do have RV parks listed. There are even some RV parks that have their own allocations in some of the BMAPs. Mike Kleiber, do you have any more info on this?
Well, a lot of that is pumped to a wastewater treatment plant, or not pumped, but hauled to a wastewater treatment plant or a septic treatment facility. And so a lot of that would be end up in however they end up treating the wastewater and either using it for reclaimed water or might get discharged somewhere. But it's basically part of the wastewater treatment process. So it's already it's taken into account in terms of how much nutrients are coming from the wastewater treatment facilities.
Thank you, Mike. All right, and our last question from Noah. Hey, Noah, thanks for being here, man. Does FDEP have the resources or staff to conduct inspection visits at a rate that would be effective enforcing the BMPs? And I have some thoughts, but I'll let George go first.
Not only do they not have the resources to have enough staff, the staff turnover is so high. I did a 1-year training program a couple years ago for the IV staff when they were starting to use IVs about BMPs and all kinds of, basic plant nutrition, fertilizers and everything. And they tell me, well, we recorded them because they told me at the time, we need to record these, Dr. Hockmuth, because the staff turnover is so great. We don't want to have you go through this all the time. So the short answer is no. There's just not enough staff, not enough money to do this, even when we're at 50%. Imagine what it would be like if we were 100%.
And I will add to that, though, that the FDEP's budget request gets fully funded every year. So the legislature is giving FDEPs every cent that they're asking for. I think the big question is, why doesn't FDEPs want to have enough funding and staff to do a good job? Because I can tell you that with the current Senate president and Commissioner Simpson and the way things are in the legislature, if FDEPs asked for the money, it would be made available. So I'm really curious as to why, just like FDEP continues to ask for only $50 million for Springs when, that won't cover one project in the Wekiva. We know the remediating septic tanks in Silver and Raisbo is going to be $1.5 billion. That's just a small percentage of the problem there. I think a big part of the problem is not necessarily the legislature, but with the agencies refusing to ask for what's actually needed to complete these programs. Bob, you have any thoughts?
No, I think you guys covered it. I might have a final thought or two before you tune out, but not.
All right. Well, yeah, let's go around the horn real quick and give some final thoughts, and we'll start with you, George.
Yeah, Ryan, let me use some of this minute to answer Sherry's question about crop rotation, because I think it's really important. She asked, what about crop rotation to keep the soil less needing of fertilizer? And that's a real good question, because some places in the country can use crop rotation very effectively, particularly if they use a nitrogen fixing crop like alfalfa or clover to as the rotation crop, because those crops take nitrogen through their nodules. There's certain special bacteria in there that can convert that. Not all rotation crops can do that. So you'd have to have that special situation, Sherry, where you can rotate a nitrogen fixing crop. Unfortunately, here in Florida, our cropping sequence, because farmers want to grow a spring crop and a fall crop, we just don't have anything that we can grow in the summertime very effectively to achieve the goal. But your question is not total. You know, I mean, there are some situations where you have a good point. And there are researchers at the University of Florida actively working on crop rotation, trying to find the right mix of commercial crop and nitrogen fixing or organic matter fixing crops to use in a rotation. It's a very old practice, as you well know, and one that we really should put some more effort into understanding. It could help in the big picture.
Thanks, George. I missed that one. Any global final thoughts?
Global final thoughts. Well, I think when I look at the agriculture situation, I try not to be too depressed because there are some options and some things have started to happen. But wow, first of all, we've got to get everybody on board with BMPs and maybe an ACE later on. But that's the first job we've got to do, is get everybody on board. And we have 50% of the people that are sitting on the sidelines. So big picture, that's the first thing we need to do.
Thanks, George. Mike Clyburn.
Well, I think each one of us can do something, and especially in the Wekiva, Rock Springs area, which is mostly urban, and those of us with St. Augustine yards could help by installing Florida-friendly landscaping. So even if you did that on a third of each of our yards, it would cut fertilizer usage by a third, which would help. You could also go with a nitrogen reducing septic tank, which is a lot more expensive, and that would help even more. But I think there are things each of us individually can do to help reduce our nitrogen footprint.
Bob Palmer.
I mentioned earlier, there was a long list of groups that requested an extension to file a challenge to these BMAPs. And we have 3 months to make a decision on that. So not only the Springs Council, groups like Mike's, but a lot of other groups that were on that list. So if we do challenge, what would we want? Well, what we fundamentally want are statutorily compliant BMAPs. And if we think that a lawsuit would help or enable that, that would be a strong factor in us deciding to take the time, the money, the effort, and all that to pursue a lawsuit. So we'll be thinking about that. I think the other things that we would like to see, or at least I'd like to see the courts actually rule. You know, we went through this process 7 years ago. In the end, I mentioned we had 3 big issues. We took First District to the First District Court of Appeals. They ruled on 1 of the 3. They dodged the other 2. I mean, if we challenge this time of year, I would hope to God we actually get them to weigh in on these issues so we actually know where we stand and we don't have to come back in 5 years and revisit issues that they didn't rule on. And the last thing I would like to get out of this and would love to see, and FSC with Ryan does a great job up in Tallahassee during session, I'd like to see the legislature actually do their job. I mean, they wrote these laws. I mentioned earlier, there's nobody left that in the legislature that was around when they wrote the act in 2016. But the legislature doesn't take these laws seriously. They need to do some oversight. They need to see that these laws are enforced, and they're just not doing it. And that's, you know, a role of all of us on this call and everybody that's listening in, is to try to get the legislators serious about the state of the springs, the state of the environment, and to actually hold the agencies accountable, which they're not doing.
Well, I want to thank you, George and Mike and Bob, for being here. This was a great webinar. I want to thank all of our watchers for hanging in with us. This is definitely our longest webinar, but it's one of my favorites. I think it's been absolutely packed with awesome information. To what Bob was just saying, if you would like to help us do just that and hold the agencies, hold polluters accountable, get the legislature to do their job, please sign up as a Springs advocate. You can scan that QR code on your screen or text FSC to 844-722-3080. We had a great legislative session overall last year. Believe it or not, the legislature is going to be meeting again in early October. We're like only 6 weeks away. And we generated over 20,000 emails and calls last year. We made a big difference. We need your help to keep that going. So if by some chance you're not an informed advocate for FSC, totally free to do that. Please sign up and help us get this done. This will be available on YouTube. So I know our Facebook stream cut out. So if anybody missed it and missed part of it, came back on YouTube, you can see the whole thing on YouTube. We'll get it loaded in a day or two. If you enjoyed this webinar, found it informative, please share it with your friends, your neighbors, anybody who's interested in water quality. And we will be back in a month with another webinar. Thank you all so much for being here and have a good night.